And hello, we are live. This is Erin Esteves, aka OG Mamacita, with Mama Talks, a production of the Mama Tribe Network. And tonight, with my steadfast partner in crime, MJ Fisher of All Things Crunchy, we are very happy to have with us Dr. Philip Goshensky for our follow-up Q&A to a discussion we had about a month ago, maybe, I think it was, about vaccines, where Dr. G kind of gave M and I and you an overview of the triumphs and tragedies of vaccines and how they help us and can hurt some people as well. So we put a call out on our social media and asked for questions, and you guys answered with tons of questions. So I sent them ahead of time to Dr. G so that he would have the chance to look them over and prepare educated answers. And so before we get into all of that, I just want to touch base with Dr. G and say, hi, Dr. G, how you doing?
Pleasure to be here.
And you, MJ, how are you doing?
Hi, I'm doing well. I'm happy it's Friday. Daddy's not working the weekend.
Woohoo!
Yeah.
And Dr. G, are you happy that it's Friday too?
I am very happy that it's Friday because my wife came back from her little vacation a couple of days ago and I'm eating normally again.
Yay!
Awesome.
The bachelor life. So, Dr. G, I sent you all of these questions, and I sent them to you in a couple of batches as I was getting them, and I had asked you if you could put them in some sort of cohesive order, because, you know, I just look at them and it was a little bit of a jumble. So, I guess I'll just pass it over to you, and then you can tell me which questions you'd like to start with.
Okay, I'd be happy to do that. I found that the questions were pretty much different from each other. The two that I thought were related, I think finally I figured out they came from the same person. So I'll try to explain that as we go along. And what I've done is I've written out the questions and then my answers so that I wouldn't forget anything and leave anything out. And I'll start by reading the first question. It says, how are the recommended potentially mandated ages for vaccine administration determined? Well, when a vaccine has been developed, it's put through trials that include anywhere from several hundred to several thousand persons. That's after the animal testing has been completed to make sure that there are no obvious side effects. And antibody levels are checked in those subjects to determine how long protection is likely to last and whether and how often booster doses are needed. Because every vaccine is different. Some of them require several boosters, some don't require any boosters at all. And we only can determine that by studying a lot of actual humans that have volunteered for this. And so that's why it's such a long and expensive process. And you know, even after human trials have been done, it sometimes turns out that the vaccine has some unexpected side effects. And one example, for instance, is the first rotavirus vaccine that was developed about 30 years ago. Rotavirus is one of the leading causes of diarrhea in children around the world. It's especially bad in undeveloped countries, but it also affects a great number, tens of thousands of children in this country. And when that vaccine was years ago, although it was found to be effective, it also turned out that the vaccine reaction in the body caused certain tissues along the walls of the intestine that are very similar to the glands that you get in your throat when you have a sore throat. We have that same kind of tissue in the lining, just under the lining of the intestine. And what happened is when those masses of tissue became enlarged because of the way they responded to the virus and the vaccine, it caused a condition called intussusception, where the intestine literally swallowed itself.
Mm.
And so it was taken off the market, and the new vaccine was produced a while back. I don't know how many years it's been now. And it seems to be a lot safer, but we're still seeing some cases of interception. So, this is one of those examples where it takes probably hundreds of thousands of doses before you really know what the effects are going to be. So it's also true that we test vaccines because the person receiving the results might be different. So, the question of how are these ages determined? It's by those trials that are done that I mentioned.
And I can see the difficulty there if it is based on volunteer. Not many people are willing to offer their children up to be guinea pigs. So
Right.
I could see how that just kind of like compounds the difficulty of actually of accurately attributing a specific age group to a desired effect.
Yeah, well, it depends on what the threat is. As an example, in the 1950s, it was no problem to get families to volunteer children for the polio vaccine, which resulted in the fact that polio has simply disappeared from the United States. There are only 3 countries on the planet where polio is still a problem because that disease has been eliminated first by the Salk vaccine and then Sabin vaccine, the oral vaccine. Only Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Nigeria which still have a serious problem with polio.
Wow.
So.
Wow. Great. And then next question, please.
Well, the next one is, why don't pediatricians explain to parents the risks in full of vaccinations per the manufacturer inserts prior to leaving infants or kids to parents and nurse for shots? Well, for the same reason that physicians don't discuss all the risks from giving an antibiotic, for example. That would dramatically reduce the number of patients that a physician could see in a day, and they don't get compensated for that. And the risks from vaccines are much lower than the risk of side effects from an antibiotic. Certainly in my practice years, I never saw a child who had a serious, long-lasting effect from a vaccine, but I saw lots of antibiotic-associated side effects, and some of those kids required hospitalization, and some of those were nearly fatal. Wow. And I have never seen that kind of response of a vaccine. Now, I know that there are some people who feel that complications of vaccines are common and often fatal or brain damaging, but they're not. Now, even the influenza vaccine, which has probably one of the highest rates of side effects, that only causes significant problems about once in every 100,000 doses. And even that number has been challenged. The most serious problem that comes from influenza vaccine, if we exclude egg allergy, which is not the problem that it used to be, is a condition called Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is a condition that affects the nervous system and can sometimes be fatal. And the estimated incidence of that is about 1 in a million doses, which is very close to the background incidence of that disease. And some statisticians feel that, in fact, the influenza virus vaccine protects people against Guillain-Barré. So this is still in the process of being evaluated. It's a serious problem, but thank heaven it's not a common one. Now, there's a publication called a Physician's Desk Reference. It's known as a PDR. And a lot of people have that at home because it's available any place. And that lists every prescription drug and every biologic product, such as vaccine. And I challenge anyone to find a single product in that volume that is entirely free of side effects. Now, some of them are only theoretical, but they make the lawyers nervous.
Yeah.
And some of them are so rare that there might only be a single case report over decades, but it gets put in there anyway. And so it's impossible to completely avoid side effects from any product that's given in prescription form. Now, think for a minute about those TV ads that we see for medications that have so many side effects that my wife and I sometimes look at each other after seeing one of those ads and say, why would anybody ever want to take that?
Totally.
Anal leakage? When they tell you anal leakage, you just lost me there.
Pardon? Pardon me?
I said when they get to the anal leakage, that's
yes.
when they lose me.
Yeah, you're like, you'd rather have whatever the disease they're trying to stop you from having or the illness, you know, than have all the side effects.
Exactly. And then, you know, if you try reading one of the package inserts that comes from any medication, including vaccines, if your doctor had to sit down with you and review every possible side effect that's listed in that package insert and explain in English each of those medical terms, think of how much time that would take. And the fact is, it's just not possible to do that.
I agree. And I think that really the only true answer is to figure out a way to make sure that parents have access to the information well ahead of time. You know, people need to take a class. You need a freaking class for this because, like you said, there's the medical terminology isn't something that an everyday layperson has or would understand. So this is a difficult quandary for sure.
If I can interject for a second, do you mind?
No, please.
Okay. Because I know that I was writing down, like you were saying, that, you know, the doctors aren't compensated, and so I just wondered, like when, I don't know if this information was available or if you even remember, but, you know, what ideally are you taught in medical school the time frame to spend with a patient when you know, evaluate them? Maybe not a new patient, but maybe a follow-up patient, or, you know, it's kind of a, like you said, it's really hard because these patients, some of these patients come to doctors looking to them for their expertise, but yet, like you say, you know, they don't get compensated to spend that amount of time. So, you know, patients should try to do their own research. But so I guess, you know, my question is really like, what time frame is a doctor supposed to spend with the patient? Like, what should we expect?
Well, that's a great question for which there is no answer. Number one,
Yeah.
That's not the kind of thing they teach in medical school.
Okay.
With some exceptions. And I think I mentioned to you that for several years, about 12 years, I was on the volunteer faculty of family medicine at UCSD Medical School. And I was teaching a course, as one of the faculty members of that course, called the doctor-patient relationship. And what we stressed in that was giving the patient a chance to ask questions. And every patient is different.
Yeah.
Something that we used to joke about is that when the patient visit is over, the last thing you want to ask a patient is, do you have any more questions? Because that doubles or triples the length of the patient contact. And so you try to get all that stuff out early, and I try to anticipate what some of the questions are. And the bottom line is that doctors do need to spend more time listening to patients, and there's no way to judge how much you can do that. For example, if you work for an HMO, and I did for a number of years, I was expected to see one patient every 10 minutes, 6 patients an hour.
Oh my God.
Well, there's not an awful lot of time in 10 minutes to find out what the problem that brought him in is, to do the kind of probing you need to get to do the exam, to tell them what you're going to do for you, and then say, do you have any more questions?
Yeah.
It's not going to happen. So I think you can begin to see what one of the problems is. Now, the good news is that patients are becoming self-educated. And one of the challenges that physicians have is patients who come into the office and they are armed with all kinds of information that they have gotten from the internet. Some of it is really kind of kooky, but some of that is pretty solid and is really are serious things that need to be discussed. And so my advice to people in general is if you have questions about vaccines, to go ahead and look this up on the internet. But I also caution patients to spend time only looking at valid sources like WebMD, which is a trustworthy source, and any site that ends with edu, or sites such as the Mayo Clinic that you know have seriously put together information that is helpful and is not just speculation or conjecture.
Yeah.
Excellent. And I think it's unfortunate because, as MJ said, we're all kind of taught to trust our doctors and to presume that they have our best interest in mind. But like you just said, Dr. G, it's almost like the Ford factory line where the patients are just moved through so quickly that it really is virtually impossible to have the kind of relationship with your doctor that that would allow for a full comprehensive understanding of your situation. So yeah, I think it's about trying to figure out how we can all find a healthy middle ground between self-educating and self-terrifying with all of those internet information.
You mean balance? Balance is so hard.
I can't tell you how often I talk to people that and I ask them what it is, and they don't know the name of it, and they don't even know why they were given that medication. I mean, they are just clueless. They just don't find out, although anybody who wants to, all they have to do is look at the label and go to Wikipedia. Now, Wikipedia might not be the best source in the world, but it is the only place you can go to get a lot of information at one site. Otherwise, you go through dozens and dozens of sites, some of which you can trust and some of which you cannot. Now, I want to comment about Wikipedia when it comes to looking at information about vaccines. I have found in looking at these subjects on Wikipedia that, number one, that the information that they give is pretty reliable and it's not based on drug science. The other thing is that for almost any topic, Wikipedia gives pages and pages of references. Right. So if you're really not sure that you can trust the information that you found in that site, you can go to the original reference and look that up on the internet and decide for yourself whether Wikipedia made the right call.
Excellent advice.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. I hope that answered the question satisfactory for the person who posed it.
Good. Well, another question is, why doesn't the medical community push to have the current effects of the CDC schedule evaluated? And I don't really know what that question means. But I would point out that the American Academy of Pediatrics, for instance, has a standing committee that does evaluate the immunization schedule and is constantly being updated. And this has been going on for decades. They have been monitoring what goes into vaccines, what the indications are. They advise what the side effects are. And as a matter of fact, the Academy publishes what's called a Red Book. It's a handbook on immunization. It's about 1.5 inches thick, and it covers every single vaccine that's currently marketed in this country, with the details of the disease that it's intended to prevent, a little bit about the history of how the vaccine was developed, what the side effects are, what to do about the side effects, and it's just a goldmine of information, and every pediatrician has that at his or her disposal.
That's fantastic. MJ, had you ever heard of this book?
I haven't heard of this book, but I'm writing it down.
I know. Me too.
I've got my pad and paper and my pen. But I think when I was hearing you read that question, Dr. G, I think that the evaluation of the CDC's immunization schedule, what I know that our groups have been talking about a lot is just the amount of vaccinations given to
Within the
newborns.
period of time, you're saying?
Yeah, I think that schedule is what they're talking about, because even who was it, John F. Kennedy Jr., who did an amazing speech, I heard, because I have not watched it yet, but about the, when he was growing up, there was an amount of vaccines that was like 20, and he said that up until he was about 20 years old or something like that, it was a very low amount, and he said that his grandchildren, or I'm not quite sure who it was, but it was like teenagers who had already been basically either
surpassed his number.
Yeah, it was between 60 to 80 vaccines that they had either been on the schedule to have or have had. And so I think that is the question, is why so many? Like even Europe doesn't have it that many. Like when I tell my friends in Europe, I tell them that, well, this is why we have a problem. This is why I have a little bit of an issue. There's just so many.
Okay, that's a very, very good point. And it wasn't addressed in these questions that came here, except that might have been the implication of that question that I just read. Well, the Kennedy you're talking about is Robert Kennedy Jr., who is somewhat of an anti-vaccination person. He says that he's not, but he's concerned about the risks. And he's right, there are risks. Now, a couple of things. He actually underestimates the number of vaccination doses that are given between 6 weeks of age and college entry. It's closer to 90 because a lot of college kids have to be re-immunized against measles, and they're getting immunized against meningitis. And those are two things that kill people. Now, when it comes to the number of different vaccines that people get, something to keep in mind as perspective is that the number of separate chemical entities, what we refer to as antigens, that are present in vaccines is a fraction of the number of those chemicals that are in live virus infection. Because vaccines, remember, are purified. They don't use all the chemical constituents of a virus. They select out the ones that give protection. And that's only about 10% on average. I'm giving you a rough estimate. And of the chemical entities within a virus are used in the vaccine. And that means you're getting much less exposure by getting the vaccine than you would get by getting the natural virus. Now, another thing to consider is that the dirt that kids eat have hundreds of thousands of times as many chemicals as are in any vaccine. Because
that's great, yeah.
And you just have to keep those things in mind, that vaccines are not just viruses. Vaccines are often just portions of a virus or a bacterium that is as antigens.
So, Dr. G,
pardon?
Sorry, in going back to staying with that question, I've asked a couple of different doctors myself in preparation for this of why they think that there are so many vaccinations kind of like clumped together at an early stage. And the answer I got from all three of them was the same, and that is basically that a lot of when the vaccine schedule is put out, they consider the fact that parents may not return or may not be consistent with physician visits, and therefore there might be a window of time when a child should get a vaccine and doesn't. So to play it safe, they just go ahead and give a bunch of vaccines at once. Can you speak to that at all? I know I didn't prepare you with that question beforehand, so I apologize.
Well, one issue is, we give what are called now combination vaccines, sometimes 4 different vaccines in one shot. Mm-hmm. And the reason for this is pediatricians were very sensitive to the fact that by the time the 3rd needle was going into that child's thigh, the mother was in tears. So we stopped giving single vaccines, and we start to combine them. And DPT, diphtheria, pertussis, tetanus is one example. MMR, measles, mumps, rubella is another example. And that cuts down the number of shots that have to be given to a child. Also, keep in mind that even where we give 3 or 4 different kinds of viruses, like MMR, for instance, in the same shot, they don't interfere with each other. Mm-hmm. Something that you will see on the internet is that when you give combination vaccines, they cancel each other out. Mm-hmm. That's pure nonsense. I mean, from a chemical, biochemical, physiological point of view, it doesn't make sense. It just flat does not make sense. And so, in addition to the fact that initially you could just think about it doesn't make sense, but those combinations have been tested to see whether we're getting the proper response in spite of the fact that 3 or 4 different things are given at the same time. And they wouldn't maintain those combinations if they weren't getting what are called good titers, good levels of antibody. And so it's the fact that mothers were concerned about getting one needle stick after another that forced the industry to start coming up with what are called a combination of vaccines. They are safe and they are effective.
So then you don't think that it had anything to do with the fact that parents weren't returning to physician visits, but it is instead to reduce just the number of injections?
I think it's a combination. I think the more immunization we can give early in life, the more likely that we can get that child completely covered. And coverage is pretty good in this country. Even in California, which has a large number of people who are against vaccines, we're still getting, I think the latest number was something like 84% of kids at school entry have the appropriate number of vaccinations. And so I just don't think that by itself is a big problem, but it simply made sense not to have to give a child 4 injections if you could give them 1.
I'm with you.
And they don't think that the amount of each of one of the viruses that they're being injected, like all at once, they don't think the amount of everything is a problem at all either?
No, it's not. Because as I pointed out, that we're giving relatively purified material, so we're getting a relatively small amount of protein, for instance, that we're giving a child, and so it's not a lot. I mean, the amount is in terms of maybe half a cc, and that's just not a lot. Yeah. And the body can handle that. Remember that every time a child picks up something like, say, a strawberry, and without washing it, that child is getting literally tens of thousands of bacteria in one mouthful, and we have no trouble handling that. In fact, it's probably good for us.
Right.
Kids should eat some fruit without washing. That's how it's been for millions of years.
So we don't actually need to vaccinate. We just need to have our kids eat dirt and eat fruits and vegetables.
That is the biggest slippery slope, MJ. Oh my goodness.
It's the crunchy way. I'm just going to call it.
MJ, you've reminded me of a very good point. I'm willing to bet that in another generation, we'll be giving most immunizations by mouth, and many of those vaccines will be made from plant products, not from the actual virus, but they will mimic the proteins within a virus and produce an antibody response. So in another generation, you're going to see a sea change in the way we immunize people.
But MJ, he wasn't saying forego vaccinations for dirty strawberries. Let's just get that straight, okay?
All right, I got it.
Nice. MJ.
I just have this big, huge dirt pile in the back, and I'm like, oh, gold mine. Like, I'm killing two birds with one stone. My kid's playing in the dirt, and he's, getting all these viruses.
Hey, didn't your mothers ever tell you have to eat a pound of dirt before you die?
Yeah.
There's something to that. We'll have to have a session sometime, talk about the pig pen theory.
Oh, yes.
It's a great topic.
Yes, definitely. Definitely. Yeah. Great. So, shall I ask you a question, or did you want to choose another one, Dr. G?
Well, either way, I've got several more questions to go here.
Have at it then, senor.
Okay, because it might be one of the questions that you have in mind.
Yes.
Okay. Now, one of the people who sent in a comment said, in regard to what was supposed to have been a balanced discussion, I did not find that balanced at all. For instance, when he referenced the religious outbreak, he was talking about people who refused treatment entirely. That is totally different from refusing a vaccine. And that's entirely correct. That the outbreak that I refer to concerned a religious group that refused any medical treatment, even though their children were obviously gravely ill, and they let the children die without taking them for medical help. Now, a better example is the polio outbreak in Holland that I also described in that PowerPoint, in which there were more than 50 cases of paralytic disease among members of a religious group that refused immunization for religious reasons, and 2 of them died. Now, I also pointed out that during that polio outbreak in Holland, there was not a single case in an immunized child. So it's obvious that some religious organizations put their members at serious risk by denying the validity of vaccines. But even the ones in Holland sought medical help when their kids were found to be paralyzed or seriously ill. So 2 different groups. The outcome, unfortunately, was tragic. But children died in each of those groups.
I think you hit. I think that hit the nail on it. You made the definitive distinction between those that chose to not receive medical attention versus those who chose not to vaccinate. So hopefully that listener will be happy with the response.
Okay.
I found it to be good.
Now, the question was, how does the medical community feel about the lack of accountability of vaccine manufacturers? Again, I really don't know what's meant by that question, because there is a government program that deals with complications of immunization, and it also provides compensation for victims that have been injured vaccines. And a lot of that was put together with the help of the medical community. Now, it's important to know that the commission that authorizes that compensation often does so even when the vaccine is not unequivocally shown to be the cause of the injury. In other words, they favor the person who was injured. Now, the marketplace also comes into play in regard to accountability. For instance, there were 30 companies that manufactured vaccines. There are now only 5 as a result of lawsuits that were very costly, even though the manufacturer was found later to be not at fault. And for the pharmaceutical industry, there are lots of things that they can do or make that are not associated with that kind of risk. And so they take the less risky route and avoid making vaccines, because the problem of vaccine-associated side effects will never go away. But even though there are side effects from something like heart drugs, for instance, or blood pressure medications, vaccines carry with them a huge emotional component, which a blood pressure medication does not. And that's one of the things that drives manufacturers out of the business. So,
I see that. Yeah, I can definitely see that. I
now,
also think that maybe if, and MJ, I'm sorry, but maybe MJ can help with this. I think that also that question may have implied the idea that vaccines can be more harmful than we're let on. MJ, is that what how you interpreted the question?
Yes, if I remember it, actually, Dr. G, can you read it one more time, because I was thinking about what it might have meant.
yeah, it says, how does the medical community feel about the lack of accountability of vaccine manufacturers?
Yeah, so I would agree with you, Aaron. I think that really it's, if people didn't, if there weren't side effects and that they didn't have, if people didn't have reactions, then I think vaccines wouldn't be really an issue. But I think that is the issue, and I think when so many people are being either personally affected, or families, or they know people who are affected, I think that's when it comes into play, where they don't understand why people are continuing to get certain things if there are a certain amount of people or that are having these reactions. But as we know, it isn't usually a high number for a lot of these vaccines, but I guess there's just some people out there who have known many people, or are just aware of the fact that there are reactions to it, and so I guess that's maybe the question.
Well, there are two things to consider here. One is that there are literally tens of millions of doses of vaccines that are given every year in this country. Now, I don't know how many cases of serious injury there are in this country from vaccines, but it's just a tiny, tiny fraction of that. I mentioned influenza vaccine, which is one of the worst. We're looking at 1 out of 100,000. And there's nothing like that with the other vaccines. I was going to make a comment near the end of these sessions that I think might put that in perspective. And my comment was that about 3,000 children die each year in this country in motor vehicle accidents, and many more are left brain damaged. Now, sometimes children die within hours or days of receiving a vaccine, but even if the vaccine were to blame for every one of those, and we know from various studies that they are not, but even if every one of those these children who had a problem with the vaccine had a problem because of the vaccine, it's nowhere near 3,000 a year. And yet we don't see the outcry of the 3,000 kids a year that we lose from motor vehicle accidents. There was a comment on one of the internet sites that 100 children die every year from vaccines. And that was simply a false claim. It was shown not to be true, but 100, which was the claim, is still a whole lot less than 3,000. But no one puts up a big fuss about what we can do about losing 3,000 babies, children a year in motor vehicle accidents, but we have put a tremendous fuss up against about a few who have non-fatal problems related to vaccines. You have to put that into perspective somehow.
I agree, and I think that's a great comparison. I think that, I know for me, one of my concerns is, just as you had mentioned earlier, that you and your wife laugh about all of the, the side effects that are listed at the end of a commercial for, say, a heartburn medication. the fact of the matter is that when we see ads to get your flu shot, or when we are reminded to go do that, we never hear that list of side effects or potential side effects for vaccines. So I know that in my situation, I am frustrated because I feel at times that parents can simply be kind of brushed aside and expected to, take this pill and don't ask kind of thing, in regard specifically to vaccines, because it's something that we're supposed to be grateful for, and therefore we shouldn't ask any questions. Again, that's just my opinion, and that's how I feel that's how I think some people feel in regard to vaccines.
Well, I can certainly comment from my own experience as a practicing pediatrician for 35 years. If parents had a concern of what the side effects of a vaccine might be, I always took the time to explain that to them. I just didn't do that with every single child who came in to be vaccinated.
Yeah.
But when the question came up, I did answer that question, and I'm willing to bet that any pediatrician does the same thing. We don't evade those questions or try to somehow sidestep them, because we know that there's a problem. For instance, I can give you one example from my practice. When I was in training, I had a baby who developed a certain kind of seizure disorder within a few days after getting a DPT vaccine. And so the mother, when the VAERS, this vaccine-related compensation program came up, even though the child at that time was in her 30s and was left brain damaged because of a seizure disorder, they applied for compensation and they were turned down. One of the reasons that they were turned down is that particular kind of seizure disorder typically arises between the first month and the 6 months after birth, whether or not the child has had a vaccination. So if it can happen to a child that had not received a vaccine, it's pretty tough to blame the vaccine just because the child had that within a few days or a couple of weeks of receiving the vaccine. That's the kind of problem that we face. And there's so many complications or side effects of vaccine. They can be caused by other factors and not the vaccine, and often there's no way to sort that out.
Right.
Yeah,
That leads us into that other question about how it is that let's see, where is it?
I'll just comment while you're looking for that, Aaron, to, go ahead, Dr. G.
Well, I may anticipate that because I put this down as a follow-on to that previous question. Someone who says, I have friends who have spent years and thousands of dollars getting their vaccine injury documented and acknowledged. Why is it so hard to get vaccine injury recognized? Well, I just touched upon that a little bit. And I really can't comment on that particular case without knowing the details. Because as I pointed out, there are lots of medical problems that have multiple causes, and vaccines are only one of them. An example is SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome, which is a terrible, terrible thing for parents to have to go through. Now, although vaccines have been blamed for those deaths, it's important to recognize that the incidence of SIDS dropped dramatically when we realized that by simply placing an infant on its back instead of face down, we were saving thousands of babies. Now, if vaccines really caused SIDS, those babies would have died no matter what position they were in.
Yeah.
So I hope that helps resolve that issue.
Yeah, that was the question that I was looking for. MJ, did you have something?
I actually, before I had my son, I worked in the medical industry for an ophthalmologist who, my God, he saw a patient every 5 minutes. It was ridiculous, I mean, and then I worked for neurosurgeons, and one of them that I worked for, he was kind of a workhorse too, you know, just in and out, in and out. And I just, you know, especially with pain medications and serious pain medications, for me, it was like mind blowing that I'm like, you have to spend more time with these people because, you know, they're clearly kind of running you and like, you know, just asking you for what they want and you're just doing it. Like it was crazy to see, but I think it's just really backwards. Like I almost love the socialist government, you know, the way that that's run. I know it's high taxes for everybody, but, you know, the physicians get paid, you know, an amount that isn't astronomical, but it is good, a good living from what, you know, the information that I've read and the things that I know from people who live over in that type of a society. But it's kind of like, you know, it's just so hard for doctors to spend that time because who are they getting paid by? They're getting paid by the insurance. I mean, I pay really high when I go to see my doctors that aren't in network, but it's because I want to see them. But who does that a lot? Not a lot of people, because it's expensive. So I was just going to comment that it's so backwards. It's kind of like teachers who are bringing up our kids and, you know, helping our kids be a part of society, but we're paying them so low that they have to get second jobs. Like, how does that's so backwards?
I know, it's not logical.
MJ, before you move to a socialist country, let me offer you something. I happen to have two personal friends who practice medicine in a socialist country, and two different countries. I will not name the countries. And both of them said that after they did their government work, they spent several hours every evening and on weekends seeing private patients who could pay cash because they could not make ends meet. They could not support their families on what the government was paying. And they would literally see almost as many patients after hours as they saw during regular working hours because the government didn't pay them enough.
Yeah, it's a difficult, there's just no utopia is the fact. There's no perfect society, there's no perfect system. Everything is organic in the sense that it's living and changing with the addition of every new element, every new person, every new it's constantly changing, and the idea that we could dream for a perfect one is I think naive, but hey.
Yeah, there's just no right way. You as a patient, you have to make your own choices, you have to do your own research.
Right. There's another interesting question that was submitted, and that is, why isn't there a movement from the medical community to reform questionable ingredients in vaccines such as heavy metals? And heavy metals include things like lead and mercury and cadmium and chromium, and there are several others. And the only one that's been associated with vaccines is mercury, but the public perception of that is extremely distorted. Now, there are several forms of mercury, and the only one that has ever been used in vaccines, and that's as a preservative, is ethyl mercury, one form of which is thimerosal. Now, that's the one that kicked off the autism controversy, although there are now more than 20 publications that have shown that there is no connection between autism and vaccines, especially thimerosal. In fact, there has been no thimerosal in any childhood vaccine since 2001. Now, the one exception is one form of influenza vaccine, and you can bet that no pediatrician is going to use that form of influenza vaccine with thimerosal, whether or not he or she believes that it has any relation to autism. They're just going to avoid that issue completely. Now, I mentioned in my PowerPoint that Japanese parents stopped immunizing their children in the 1990s because of the extreme fear of autism. But in Japan, the incidence of autism kept climbing anyway at exactly the same rate. There was not even a slight dip in the incidence of autism. And those kids were not being immunized at all. Now, it's been almost 15 years since any child received mercury in a vaccine, but as we know the incidence of mercury and these other heavy metals are simply not present in vaccines. Now, when there are questionable ingredients, there are things like antibiotics, but they are in extremely tiny amounts, like 0.001 milligrams of something like neomycin, for instance, or something that might be used as a chemical to prevent contamination. So these extraneous materials are just not part of the vaccine process. Certainly, we're very sensitive about lead, and there's no way you can find lead in any vaccine.
So we can chalk this one up to misinformation.
In my opinion, yes. Now, if anybody wants to write to me and point out that they are aware of heavy metals in vaccines, please, I will research that and I will look it up, but I'm not aware of any heavy metal in any vaccine. Now, the risk is just too high. If there is any at all, it is in tiny, tiny amounts, and we get more than that from our food. Now, for instance, I don't know whether you guys go to Trader Joe's. Trader Joe's was recently put on the list of companies that sells wine contaminated with arsenic.
Right.
But when the research was done, it was found that people get more arsenic in their food than is present in Trader Joe's wine. And so, again, it's putting things in perspective.
We don't go to Trader Joe's. No. That's good. Sorry, I was just going to go off on a tangent, but I will not digress.
Yeah, let's not talk about that.
One of 19 different companies that sell wine with arsenic. So I just picked that one because
that's good.
I get the organic sulfite-free wine from Trader Joe's.
Why?
It's actually. What's that?
Why sulfite-free? Getting sulfite-free wines.
Yeah, I'm sorry, it cut out for a second. Can you say it again?
Why do you bother to look for sulfite-free wines?
It's just one of those type of things that I don't really. I mean, we try not to do any of that in any of our food. Just kind of. I don't know. I think that just what I've read and just what I know about just my food in general, I just try to limit it or stay away as much as possible.
Okay. Do you eat sulfite-free apricots?
Yes, actually, I don't buy them because they have sulfur in them.
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah, I used to love them, and they're such a quick, easy snack when you have a child, and they're yummy, but I can't find ones that don't have sulfur in them, so.
Well, you need some sulfur in food, so don't go too far in that direction.
Yeah.
Sulfur deficiency, who knows?
I know. There's so many things that could happen in that way. It's funny, the organic wine at Trader Joe's is like less expensive than my favorite wine in the whole wide world that I've loved forever, who I'll buy every now and then because I just love it. But I that was one of the things for me. I was like, it's organic and it's $5. Like, oh my gosh.
So, hey, Dr.
G.
Go ahead. Go ahead. I was going to segue into one, but you can do it.
Well, there's an interesting question that came up, which is, I think, pretty timely, and that is, my pregnant sister is forcing my parents to get tetanus, diphtheria, pertussis, measles, mumps, rubella vaccine. Would you be concerned since they have such direct contact with the child? Now, how long do people really shed for? The comment about eczema, I don't know how that relates in there. She says, I'm torn as to what to do. Well, keep in mind that your sister is not alone. It's common for parents to insist that grandparents or any other visitors be immunized against pertussis or else not to visit until the baby has received all 3 primary doses of the pertussis vaccine. And that's because unless the mother has received pertussis vaccine in the last couple of months of pregnancy, her infant is susceptible to that disease, which is otherwise known as whooping cough. Now, infants below the age of 6 months have the highest fatality rate because having only 1 or 2 doses of the vaccine is not adequate to protect them. It takes 3 full doses before a child is properly protected against whooping cough. Now, there is no reason for the grandparents to receive vaccines for diphtheria, tetanus, measles, mumps, or rubella, because all those things have disappeared in this country except for measles, as we know from the recent Disneyland outbreak. And a baby's not going to get measles anyway, because babies below the age of 6 months just don't get measles, because even if their mothers received their measles vaccine years before, they still get enough transplacental antibody to protect them against measles, so that's not an issue. It's only whooping cough. And the reason that's important because when when an adult has pertussis, it looks like a plain old bronchitis. They don't get the characteristic whoop and the difficulty breathing that babies get, and which often kills babies. And it looks to them like either a bad cold, especially in the early stages, or a bronchitis, and yet those people can infect a young child. And I really get nervous every time I'm out in public someplace and I see a mom carrying a baby in a sling against her chest, and the baby's clearly only days old or a couple of weeks old, because I'm thinking that pertussis is always around in the community. And those babies are susceptible to pertussis until they receive the immunization.
I know that I did, my husband and I did ask that our immediate family have that vaccine before they met our son, because his birth happened to coincide with an outbreak of whooping cough here in San Diego. So for us, it was first parent jitters and statistic-loving people. We were just like, okay, you're coming over, you got to get a shot. You got to get a shot.
Well,
is that pertussis in adults is almost entirely free of side effects. A little bit of soreness of the arm, and that's it. It's not going to cause the super high fevers and the other problems. Really, the wipeout type of symptoms that babies get with their pertussis vaccine.
When I gave birth to my son, my midwives told me to at least stay. They actually just recommended just to stay in the house for 28 days. That some tribes, you just stay in the house. Everybody brings food to you, this and that. Well, I stayed in the house for like 3 months. I didn't. I couldn't even. Well, we had a low milk supply, and I was feeding a supplemental nursing system, and feeding at the breast. So I was like, I am not going out. So I guess that worked for me.
One side benefit.
Yes.
Erin, you had another question?
Yeah, I do. And this, this was one of the questions, and I might be jumping over your sequence of things. But what about gut health in relation to vaccine injuries?
That's really fascinating. I have been doing a lot of reading these days, a lot of research on probiotics and gut health. And I think I probably mentioned in the PowerPoint program that whole area of research is in its absolute infancy. We thought we knew a lot about normal flora, and we're finding out we don't. And when it comes to vaccines, what we know is that the gut flora can influence the immune response, but no one has yet done any studies to show what different bacteria in our gut do in relation to altering the response to the vaccines. It will be decades before we know that, because just a few years ago we thought that there were only about 150 different kinds of bacteria that populate our our skin, our mouth, our GI tract, and now we know it's about 1,000. And it's not possible to grow most of them, like about 800 of them, in the laboratory. They can only be identified by their genetic signature. And so it's going to be a long time before we can put together vaccine responses and gut population. Remember that gut population changes possibly over a matter of days, and certainly over a matter of months, and it changes very much in that first year of life when the child's getting his or her vaccines. And I mean, you talk about a can of worms.
Yeah.
Pardon the pun. but it's going to be a long time before we sort that one out. So don't hold your breath.
Okay. I won't. And as I cough, I do not have pertussis. I have bronchitis, but maybe I was misdiagnosed.
Sure. There was another question I thought was kind of fascinating, because I was never in a position to deal with it, and that is, what do the doc and his colleagues require in order to write a medical exemption? Well, what we require is our knowledge of the patient. Now, there is a form that's available from the state, and it's probably available at every school administrator's office. And I called a couple of schools today, but I guess they left on summer vacation early because they either weren't there or they never returned my call. And there are actually 7 different categories of exemptions, and the form is available on the internet. And if you just Google exemption information sheet, that's exemption information sheet, it will come up near the top. And for most of them, like there are 7 different exemptions, for 6 of the 7, it takes a written statement from a physician to explain why this child should not receive a vaccine. Now, 3 of them are because the child has had laboratory confirmed disease, either measles or mumps or rubella. And so if those diseases have been documented, then the child does not need those vaccines. So I can understand why parents would be reluctant to give them when they are unnecessary. Now, the last exemption was called a personal beliefs exemption, and the physician is not part of that. That is just a statement on the part of the parent that they don't want their child immunized because of personal belief. And as you know, there is a real battle going on in California because of that law, and that's another can of worms. But that's not going to be settled right away, because whatever the outcome is on that legislation, it's going to end up before the California Supreme Court a year or 2 from now.
Yeah, that's a scary thing, but I think that we all just need to keep voicing our opinions, and hopefully
in my opinion, as far as that is concerned, I think that it really boils down to information and people understanding that, because I use myself as a perfect example for that, because I had been exposed to tuberculosis, and then I had 2 botched TB tests. So I have been told by several doctors that I cannot get TB tested again, or it would be very problematic for me. So that bill, if I were to work in the school system, would require me to get the TB test. So I would not be able to work in the school system in California. So a lot of people don't understand that it's more than just vaccines.
Yeah.
At issue there.
I'm not sure that's entirely true, because if you've had a positive tuberculin test,
it wasn't positive. It was inconclusive.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you have a large reaction?
I did, and the first reaction was inconclusive, and then when they gave me the second test, she did it on the same arm, and actually overlapping the first one. Yeah. So I did the whole 6 months of medication and all the the x-rays and all of that such. So I've never been diagnosed with active tuberculosis.
Well, for anybody who has gone through that kind of thing, where the skin test is problematic, there is now a blood test that can be done. And what you can do is request the blood test in place of the skin test.
Oh, sweet.
That's great to know.
That is awesome.
That's your pearl for the day, guys.
Thank you.
Yay.
I actually need to get a TB test for Jay's co-op preschool because I'm working with the kids, and so are the other parents. And I was like, I heard about the test, and I've never had it done, and I was like, I don't want to do that.
Well, you know, it's certainly not a painful test.
No.
But it has to be done right. We've talked about this in the past when we got together, that I have seen so many screw-ups on the TB skin test, either in the way it was put into the skin or in the way it was read.
Yeah.
I mean, it'll curl your toenails.
Oh man, I just
you know,
yeah.
It's a common problem.
I just don't want anybody putting anything in me
Yeah,
Well,
I'm not going to touch that comment, MJ.
I know. I realized after I said it that was. This is a vaccine show.
Boom, get it? No, just kidding. Okay, hey, Dr. G, I have one last question.
Mm-hmm.
Oh no, I have two last questions. The first one is about should kids with food allergies still get all of the recommended vaccines per the CDC schedule?
Okay. There are lots of different food allergies, and the only significant food allergy that might interfere with immunization is egg allergy. I mean, certainly allergy to peanuts doesn't apply. There are no peanut antigens, allergens in vaccines or seafood or anything like that. But there are scores of research papers on that topic, and it's really rarely a problem, because if a child can eat eggs, then he or she will be able to tolerate the vaccine. However, if the parents are concerned, the child can be immunized, but should be washed for a minimum of half an hour and probably 1 hour. And that's, again, only for the influenza vaccine, because other food allergies don't apply to things like polio and DPT, etc. Now, there have been some children and adults who have received the influenza vaccine that does have a little bit of egg protein in it, who have had potentially fatal reactions. However, it turns out that those reactions are easy to manage. They sound horrible, and if you're ever going through it, it's a horrible experience, but the fact is that they can be quickly reversed. And two recent reviews that I have read on that subject discuss a number of patients who had those reactions, and there was not a single death, and they didn't even have to be hospitalized.
Wow.
And so it's really kind of a non-issue regarding food allergies.
Oh, excellent. That's good to know. I think that because at some point people were under the assumption that things like eczema or even conditions like asthma might somehow affect how their body processes the vaccine. So I think that's what the concern was. Is that how you interpreted it, Em?
Yeah, you know, I think that kids with food allergies and just food sensitivities, I from what I can gather from other mamas and parents that I know, the sensitivity to, you know, a food or something, I guess we kind of think of it as a parallel. Well, if our kids are sensitive to a food, you know, then the chemicals that are in certain processed foods they might be sensitive to. So the chemicals in these vaccines they could be sensitive to. So.
Well, you bring up a good point, and we have something in medicine called the allergic diathesis. And what that says is if a person has one kind of allergy, then it's a pretty good bet they got some other kind of allergy as well. And allergies, as you know, run in families.
Yeah.
And so it's not unusual for a person to be allergic to more than one kind of food, for instance, or some sort of chemical. But when it comes to vaccines, that's a pretty small problem. I never encountered that in all the years that I practiced.
Okay.
Good, good.
First, I never had a child who had a vaccine and then had an asthma attack. I just never saw that. Yeah. Now, asthma can be triggered by a variety of viruses, but those are the ones that actually get established in the airway and cause infection.
Yeah. And I think one of the things too, just, for our family dealing with food sensitivities, and actually we're going to be soon tested for true allergies, but the having the sensitivities and just the amount of time, if you are say, for a gluten sensitivity, when children get gluten and they shouldn't have gluten, then the detoxing time for that, and just the emotional roller coaster and everything that you go, like, you just, as a parent, you think of all those things and you think of, my God, if this is what food is, doing to my child, I can't, you just think, I guess, the worst about, a possible reaction that could be fatal, choosing to get immunized, I guess.
Well, when it comes to something like wheat, there's a difference between a wheat allergy and gluten sensitivity. They are two entirely different phenomena. And so you can have one or the other, but not both.
Great. Well, I mean, not great that you have one or the other, or...
Now, there was another question here that was kind of complicated, and I think it was from the same person who had similar questions that we've already touched on. Says, I thought it was interesting that he said one vaccine was completely safe because it wasn't a live virus. It's a big statement to say that. I'm curious what his thoughts on our kiddos with food allergies and vaccine safety. Again, prior question. The blood-to-brain barrier, gut health in connection with bad reaction to vaccines, no accountability for vaccine companies. What are his thoughts on the blood-brain barrier, and what about gut health? So again, you see, I think the same person submitted the same questions, but here's what I had to say about all that. When I said that a vaccine was safe, I was referring to the fact that a killed virus vaccine cannot cause the disease that it's intended to prevent. Now, you may be aware that we stopped using the oral polio vaccine several years ago. That's because polio was eradicated from the United States, and the live vaccine, the Sabin vaccine, sometimes produced a polio-like illness at a time when there was no wild polio being circulated. And we now have returned to the Salk vaccine, which is a killed virus, and the Salk vaccine has not caused polio since it was put back into the vaccine schedule. Now, someone might say, well, what about the Salk vaccine that caused polio back in the early 60s? And that's true. That was what's known as a Cutter incident.
Oh, right.
And I think that was 1962, where the manufacturer, who had been around for a long time, somehow they fouled up on the quality control, and a number of children, a couple of hundred as a matter of fact, developed polio from that so-called killed virus vaccine. That is no longer the problem, because now they're very careful that the Cutter type incident will never occur again. Now, in regard to gut health, it's quite possible, as I mentioned, that since our good bacteria do influence our immune system, anything that disrupts those bacteria could influence a person's response to a vaccine. However, this entire issue of probiotics, as I mentioned, the good bacteria or normal flora, is in its infancy, and we're going to be learning a lot about it over the next couple of days. And in regard to the blood-brain barrier, I don't know what the question was referring to. There are actually several blood-brain barriers, and they allow small molecules to pass from the blood into the brain tissue. But vaccines are composed of such large molecules that they don't pass through the blood-brain barrier, so that barrier is not a factor in immunizations.
I think that answers the question right there, because that was my question also. I had never even considered the blood-brain barrier in regard to vaccines. So good to know that it's not an issue based on the size of the
Right.
molecule used in the vaccine.
Right.
Wow.
Now, it's true that some vaccines have caused a type of encephalitis, but that's because of frank infection that can be caused. I don't want to say infection, but something that actually changes the nature of the blood-brain barrier so that inflammation of the brain can occur. That's not the same as a vaccine simply trying to get through the blood-brain barrier. That's a host that has a susceptibility to that vaccine. And as I mentioned, if a person has a severe reaction to a vaccine, it's probably that they would have had a really bad reaction if they had the live virus. And there's some vaccines that typically will cause that. For instance, the encephalitis vaccine, Japanese encephalitis vaccine, sometimes causes that kind of problem. But again, if those people who had encephalitis with the vaccine had been exposed to the real thing, they probably would have ended up on the mortality list.
Wow. I am just blown away at, first of all, how great you are, excuse me, at explaining these things, and how just how easy it is to ask you these questions, and how I really appreciate the fact that you're willing to take any question from any of our viewers. And I'm sure that we may have some follow-up questions, and I'll make sure to get those to you, and then maybe we can just have like either a Facebook or some other kind of quick discussion to answer those questions. MJ, did you have? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
There's one other question. There's one other question I wanted to address, and that is, has he ever seen a vaccine injury? And I have never seen a serious vaccine-related injury. However, when we were using the old DPT vaccine, I saw lots of kids who had high fevers, and some of them were really sick for a couple of days, and some of them even had seizures because of the high fever, not because the vaccine damaged the brain, but because the high fever caused a seizure. Now, I've never seen brain damage caused by a vaccine, but I had several patients during my career that had severe brain damage due to the kinds of meningitis that has virtually disappeared since we've had vaccines for H. flu, Haemophilus influenzae meningitis, and pneumococcal meningitis. Pneumococcal was a devastating kind of meningitis. Now, for example, during my 2 years of pediatric training in a large hospital on the East Coast, there was almost never a week during those 2 years in which we didn't have one or more patients on the ward, which was about a 20-bed ward, with H. flu meningitis. Wow. Now, within 3 or 4 years of the introduction of the vaccine, Haemophilus influenzae meningitis became so rare that it's now possible for a pediatrician to go through his or her entire medical training and for several years of practice without ever having seen a single case of that disease. And so the fact that the incredible drop in diseases caused by those two is something that you can only appreciate if you've seen the consequences of the real disease. And I saw a lot of that, unfortunately, during my my years in training.
Yeah.
So if you have any other questions, feel free, or we can always do a follow-up session if this has generated more questions.
I have a feeling it might, and I'm totally fine with that. I know it takes me a little while to process information, so that's why I suddenly go into a blank stare. It's not that I've traveled elsewhere, it's that I'm trying to figure out how to phrase things or comprehend something. Em, you were going to say something a minute ago?
No.
Yeah.
No?
Not me, but I'm right there with you. That's why I have to write my stuff down so that I can kind of keep it all together, because I agree. The way that you present it, Dr. G, is I think one of the positive things about your presentation is it's very fact oriented, and it's in that case, you don't hear any sides being taken.
Right.
It's just matter of fact, and I love how even just the facts. I love even how you even though if you didn't know what a question necessarily meant, you kind of interpreted maybe what you thought it might have meant. So I really appreciate that too.
Okay, you're very welcome.
Well, Dr. G, I think that we've definitely gone over, but that's quite all right, because these questions were important and people needed to hear the answers to them to have some kind of either sanity check or a springboard for further research. And I really do hope that if anything, parents do take the time to either request that pamphlet for the vaccines before their appointment in lieu of canceling the appointment. And I really hope that parents begin to take as much information and action with vaccines as they do with food. Meaning some people spend a lot of time and energy researching food before they introduce it to their child, and I hope that perhaps they would also do that with vaccines and some movies, but that's another show altogether. So
you bring up a good point, and I hope that sometime we can talk about the epidemics of childhood obesity and type 2 diabetes, because those two problems are going to kill a whole lot more of our children than all the vaccines that have ever been produced.
Yeah.
It's shocking.
Well, I think I hopefully you would agree, but I mean, if a person's unhealthy, that's really not great to introduce a vaccine into an unhealthy person. So, if we're bringing up our children diseased and overweight, I mean, that's really not a good situation to try to introduce, even though they would be helpful, if you're healthy versus unhealthy.
I don't know, Jim. I don't think that there would be an instance other than like severe infirmary for a doctor just to say that the child isn't healthy enough to receive vaccines.
No, I'm not saying that a doctor shouldn't introduce a vaccine, but I'm saying that Dr. G is pointing out about how there's the way that we're going with our children and the obesity and the diseases that they're starting to get, there could be more reactions in those type of kids because of the factors that
the physical landscape has changed, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So, we have an unhealthy society. We have unhealthy children, even though these immunizations could help the health of our children. If they're unhealthy to begin with, then maybe that might cause a problem too. So
you bring up a point that I have never seen addressed in any literature, except indirectly, and that is that both obesity and type 2 diabetes lower the immune response.
Yeah.
And there may be some studies on this I'm just not aware of.
Yeah.
But my opinion, and it's only my opinion, is that if someone reaches teen years and has type 2 diabetes, and there's a lot of those kids out there right now, and is obese, they're not going to have the same kind of response to a vaccine as a child who's free of diabetes and of normal weight, which means that we might have to have a different vaccine schedule for obese diabetic children when they go to college, because they might not get the same response to the meningitis vaccine or the measles vaccine or the pertussis vaccine and that could give them a false sense of security.
Yeah.
Wow, more factors to consider.
Yeah, I know for a fact that my immune system is much better now that I am, I've lost weight and my eating habits have changed. I mean, when I was younger and I was heavier and I was eating crappy, I mean, I would get sick all the time, so I can just imagine, the immune system and the way that it is dropped and unhealthy in our society and children.
Okay. Well, I hope we get together again and can talk about some of these issues.
Absolutely, I love chatting with you. You are a fountain of information.
Oh,
thank you. And you're fun to talk to. On top of it,
I know. The reason why we went over is we just love hanging out with you.
Oh, thank you. The feeling is mutual.
Why, thank you. So we'll continue our love fest after I turn off the live. So I want to thank everybody for watching us. And if you have any questions, feel free to get them to us, and we will get them to Dr. G, or you can go to his website, which is thestoneagedoc.com, correct?
Correct.
Correct. Okay. And ask him yourself. But that's it for us. And if you have any questions, like I said, get to us and watch other shows produced by Mama Tribe Network, like All Things Crunchy with Miss MJ Fisher, and our weekly Live with Mama Tribe on Thursdays. Thanks, and have a good one.
Hey.